You know, after 40 years on this bench, I thought I had seen everything. I thought there was nothing left that could make me stop in the middle of a court session and just forget for one moment where I was. But one Thursday morning, a man walked into my courtroom and changed all of that. He was a veteran. He came in for a handful of traffic tickets. He owed the city some fines. That was supposed to be the whole story. It was supposed to be quick, routine, a few minutes maybe, and then he'd be on his way. But the moment he opened his mouth, the moment I looked into his eyes and saw that smile, that broken, guarded smile he wore like armor, I knew this was not going to be routine. I knew this day was going to stay with me for the rest of my life. And it has. Every single day since then, I think about that man. I think about what he said. I think about what he carried. And I think about what I learned from him, standing right there in my own courtroom. But before I tell you this whole story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Because what I'm about to share with you is something that needs to be heard. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single word of this. I've been a judge in Providence, Rhode Island for 40 years. 40 years. I've seen so much in that time that sometimes the memories blur together. Thousands of cases, thousands of faces, thousands of stories. But some stories, some mornings, some people, they just cut right through all of it. They find a place inside you and they stay there. This veteran was one of those people. Every morning I come to the courthouse at 8:15. Been doing it that way since 1984. I park in the same spot. I walk through the same door. I go upstairs and I pour myself a coffee, strong and black. No sugar, no cream. Christina, my clerk, has been with me so long that sometimes she already has the cup ready before I even ask. That's what 40 years looks like. Routine built from trust, from familiarity, from showing up every single day and doing the same thing with the same care and the same intention. My father came to this country from Italy with almost nothing. He had the clothes on his back, a few dollars, and a belief that if you worked hard and treated people right, this country would give you a chance. He used to tell me every morning before I went to school, he would say, "Frank, look at every person you meet today, and remember, they are carrying something you cannot see. Be kind. Always be kind." I was maybe 10 years old when he first said that to me. I didn't fully understand it then. I understand it now more than ever. I became a lawyer first, then a judge. I didn't take this bench to be powerful. I took it because I believed, and I still believe, that the law can be a place of real fairness. That when someone who has very little stands next to someone who has everything, in my courtroom, they stand on exactly the same ground. That has always been my purpose. That has always been my North Star on the days when this job is hard, on the days when the cases are painful, on the days when you look at someone and you feel the weight of their life pressing down on the room. I've been married to my wife for 48 years. She knows me better than anyone. She knows when I've had a hard day before I even walk through the front door. She can read it in my face. On the evening after I met this veteran, I came home and I sat down at the kitchen table, and I didn't say anything for a long time. She sat down across from me, and she didn't say anything either. She just waited. And then I told her everything. And when I was done, she had tears in her eyes. And that told me everything I needed to know about why this story matters and why I'm telling it to you now. That particular Thursday, I remember the weather was gray. It was early autumn in Providence, the kind of morning where the sky can't make up its mind between clouds and clearing. I drove in with the radio off. I do that sometimes when I need the quiet, when I need to just prepare myself for whatever the day is going to bring. Christina greeted me at the top of the stairs like always. She handed me my coffee. She said the calendar was full, but nothing unusual, just a regular Thursday docket. Traffic violations, parking tickets, a few minor municipal cases. I said good, sat down at my desk, and started reading through the files. I go through every single file before I take the bench. I know some people find that surprising, but I want to know who is coming into my courtroom. I want to understand, as best I can from a sheet of paper, what I'm walking into. Most of the time, the files are thin. A name, a charge, a date, not much else. But every once in a while, something in those pages makes me sit up straight. His name was Daniel Reyes. He was 34 years old. He had 3 parking violations and 1 ticket for running a stop sign in a residential neighborhood. The fines added up to just over $450. I looked at his address, and I noticed it was a veterans transitional housing facility on the east side of the city. I paused at that. I held the file in my hands a little longer than usual. Something about it stayed with me, even as I put it back in the stack and moved on to the next one. Something about his name and that address together made me feel, the way my father used to say, that there was something here I couldn't see yet. I took the bench at 9 o'clock, like always. The courtroom filled up with the usual Thursday morning crowd. People sitting in the gallery, some nervous, some bored, some looking at their phones. Families sometimes come along. Occasionally someone brings a child, and I always notice that. I always think about what those children are seeing, what they're learning just by sitting in that room. Christina called the first case, and we moved through the morning at a steady pace. I handled a woman in her 70s who had 3 parking violations near the hospital where her husband was receiving chemotherapy treatments. I dismissed every single one of them. It took me about 2 minutes to understand what was happening in her life. She didn't have to say much. I could see it in the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hands wouldn't stay still. I told her to take care of her husband and to go home. She started crying right there at the podium, and I had to hold myself together. Christina passed her a tissue box, and the whole room went quiet for a moment, the way a room does when it recognizes something sacred. Then there was a young man, couldn't have been more than 22, who had a stack of parking tickets from his job site because there was no legal parking within 3 blocks of where he was doing construction work. He was polite. He was respectful. He came dressed in his work clothes because he told me he had to be back on site by noon. I reduced his fines significantly and told him to write a letter to the city zoning board about the parking situation. I told him he was right to be frustrated, and that didn't mean he could ignore the tickets, but it did mean I could be fair about them. He shook his head and said, "Thank you, Your Honor, thank you," and I could hear the relief in his voice. I moved through several more cases. A student, a delivery driver, a retired teacher, all of them with stories, all of them with lives much bigger than the piece of paper in front of me. That's what I've always understood about this work. The case is never just the case. The person is always more than the charge. And then Christina called his name. She said, "Daniel Reyes," and I watched the door to my courtroom open. Now let me pause here for just a second. I need to ask you something. Have you ever looked at someone and just known, before they said a single word, that they were carrying something incredibly heavy, something that had changed them, something that the rest of the world couldn't quite see? Leave me a comment because I actually read them. And if you're enjoying this story, hit that like button for me. Because what happens next with Daniel is something I think about almost every single week. He walked in slowly. He wasn't young the way some young people look young, full of energy, bouncing on their heels. He walked like someone who was measuring every step. He was tall, probably 6 feet, with a lean, strong build that told you he had been physical in his life, trained, disciplined. He was wearing a clean pair of jeans and a button-down shirt, dark blue, tucked in. His hair was short and neat. He was clean-shaven. You could see he had made an effort that morning. You could see he had tried to put himself together carefully, deliberately, the way someone does when they're walking into a place that requires respect and they want to give it. But his face was something else entirely. I've looked at thousands of faces from this bench. I've learned to read faces the way some people read books. I've seen guilt and innocence, fear and anger, shame and defiance. I've seen grief that has had years to settle into someone's bones. I've seen relief that looks almost like collapse. I've seen joy that surprises even the person feeling it. But his face had something I can only describe as a particular kind of quiet, a controlled quiet, like a man who had learned, somewhere along the way, to keep the storm completely inside. And that smile. I noticed the smile right away. He smiled as he approached the podium. It was a real smile, in the sense that it used the right muscles. But I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between a smile that comes from the inside and a smile that a person puts on because the world expects to see one. His smile was the second kind. It was polished, practiced. It was the kind of smile that says, "I'm fine, don't worry about me, everything is okay." But his eyes didn't match it. His eyes were somewhere else entirely, somewhere far away and quiet and a little bit cold, the way eyes get when they've seen too much and decided to stop reacting to new things. I looked down at his file. Then I looked back up at him. I said, "Mr. Reyes, I have you here today on 3 counts of parking in a prohibited zone and 1 moving violation, failure to stop at a stop sign. The total fines come to $452. Do you understand the charges against you?" He said, "Yes, Your Honor, I do." His voice was measured, even, the kind of voice that has been trained to stay level no matter what is happening internally. I said, "How do you plead?" He said, "Guilty, Your Honor, all of them. No hesitation, no drama, just guilty." I appreciated that. I always appreciate directness. It tells me something about a person. I said, "All right, can you tell me about the circumstances? Can you help me understand what was going on with these violations?" And this is the part I want you to really hear. This is the part that changed everything for me that morning. He paused. He looked down at his hands on the podium for just a second. Then he looked back up at me with that smile still in place, that careful, armored smile, and he said, "Your Honor, honestly, I don't have a great excuse. The parking ones were from when I couldn't find legal parking near the VA hospital, and I was running late for my appointments. And the stop sign, I just missed it. I should have been more careful. I accept the fines." I leaned forward a little. I said, "You said VA hospital. You're a veteran?" He said, "Yes, sir. 2 tours, Iraq and then Afghanistan." I said, "What branch?" He said, "Army, infantry." I nodded. I let a moment pass. The courtroom was very quiet. I could feel the people in the gallery paying attention differently now. The energy in the room had shifted just slightly. I said, "Mr. Reyes, how long have you been back stateside?" And again that pause, that brief journey inward before the answer came back out. He said, "About 2 years now, Your Honor." I said, "And how are you doing? How are things going?" I know that might seem like an unusual question for a judge to ask someone standing in front of him on traffic charges, but something in me needed to ask it. Call it instinct, call it 40 years of experience, call it my father's voice in my ear, reminding me that everyone is carrying something I can't see. I needed to ask. And when I asked it, something happened to his face. It was small, it was brief, but I caught it. For just one fraction of a second, that careful smile cracked. Not completely, not dramatically, just a tiny shift, like a hairline fracture in a wall you thought was solid. His eyes changed. They became more present, more raw, and then they went back to that controlled distance almost immediately. And he said the words that I have carried with me every day since. He said, "I'm managing, Your Honor." I came back a little different than when I left. I'm still figuring out what that means. I came back a little different than when I left. I want you to sit with those words for a moment, because in 40 years, in thousands of cases, thousands of people standing at that podium, I have never heard someone describe something so enormous with something so quiet. I came back a little different, like he was describing a minor inconvenience, like he was describing changing his haircut or switching his coffee brand. But what I heard underneath those simple words, what I felt in the room when he said them, was something that had no simple description. It was the weight of a man who had gone somewhere terrible and come back carrying things that the rest of the world couldn't see and wouldn't understand. I said, "Mr. Reyes, can I ask you something personal?" He said, "Of course, Your Honor." I said, "Do you have family here? Is anyone here with you today?" And that was the moment. That was the question that opened everything up. He looked at me. The smile stayed in place, but his jaw tightened just slightly, and he said, "No, Your Honor, I came alone." He paused, "I came back alone too. My wife, we separated about 8 months ago. She said I wasn't the same person she married. She was right, I wasn't. I'm not. I told her I was working on it, but she said she couldn't wait anymore. I understand that. I don't hold it against her. It was too much." The courtroom was absolutely silent. I've been married for 48 years. I've seen marriages tested by illness, by financial hardship, by the loss of children. I've seen marriages survive things that should have broken them. And I've seen marriages end over things that seem small from the outside. But a marriage ending because a man went to war and came back changed, came back carrying invisible weight, came back needing things that were hard to give, came back in a body that looked the same but housed a different kind of soul. That is one of the most heartbreaking things I have ever heard in my courtroom. I had to take a breath. I placed my hands flat on my desk in front of me. I looked at him very carefully. I said, "Mr. Reyes, I want to thank you for telling me that. I know that wasn't easy." He said, "It's okay, Your Honor. I'm used to telling people I'm fine." He smiled again, that same armored smile. He said, "I'm getting better, slowly, but I'm getting better." I said, "Are you getting support? Are you connected with the VA services?" He said, "Yes, sir. I go to therapy twice a week now. It took me a while to start. Didn't think I needed it. You know how that goes. But I started, and it's helping." I said, "Good. I'm glad to hear that." I'm going to be honest with you. At this point in my morning, sitting on that bench looking at this man, I was struggling to keep my professional composure. And I say that as someone who has been doing this for 4 decades. I've trained myself to remain balanced, to not let my emotions drive my rulings, to make decisions based on facts and law and fairness. But this man, this young man with his armored smile and his VA appointments and his empty passenger seat, he had gotten through all of that training and reached something much more basic in me, something human. If you've ever felt your heart break a little for a complete stranger, you know what I'm talking about. Hit that like button if you're still with me, and make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next in this story, I never fully saw coming. I said, "Mr. Reyes, can I ask about your current situation? Work, housing, things like that." He said, "I'm at a veterans transitional place right now. I had an apartment, but when my wife moved out, I couldn't keep up the rent on my own. The VA benefits help. I'm looking for work. I had a job lined up in construction management, but the company had a hiring freeze. So I'm still looking. It's okay. I've been in worse situations." That last line, "I've been in worse situations," said with that same measured voice, same smile. And I thought, yes, you have. You have been in far worse situations. You went to places where people were trying to kill you. You survived that. And now you're standing in my courtroom for $452 in parking tickets, and you're telling me it's okay. You're telling me you've been in worse situations, and you believe it. That's what hit me. He genuinely believed it. This was his normal now, navigating a world that had moved on without him while he was gone, carrying things no one around him could see, showing up to courts and appointments and therapy sessions alone, wearing that smile so the world wouldn't worry. I looked down at his file one more time. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just needed a moment to gather myself, to organize my thoughts, to make sure I did right by this man. Let me tell you something I've learned in 40 years on this bench. People come before you with charges written on paper, but the paper never tells the real story. The paper gives you the what. It never gives you the why. It never gives you the whole human being standing in front of you. My job, as I've always seen it, is to look past the paper and see the person, to ask the questions the paper can't answer, and then, when I've heard those answers, to make a decision not just with my knowledge of the law, but with my conscience, my heart, and everything my father taught me about what it means to be a fair and decent human being. I said, "Mr. Reyes, How much do you know about the Providence parking situation near the VA hospital? He said, I know it's tough. There's never enough legal spots. A lot of guys from my group have the same problem. I said, your group? You mean a veterans group? He said, yes, sir. We meet twice a week at the VA. Peer support group. It helps to be around people who understand what you've been through, who don't look at you like something is wrong with you when you react to certain things a certain way. I nodded slowly. I said, I can imagine that's a very important thing to have. He said, it is, Your Honor, more than I can explain. There was a woman in the gallery. I noticed her then, maybe 55 years old, sitting toward the back. She had her hand over her mouth. She was crying quietly. I don't know her story. I don't know if she had a son who served, a husband, a brother, but she was crying for Daniel Reyes, and she didn't even know him. That's what I mean about how some people's stories cut through everything. They reach the shared human place in all of us, the part that knows, without being told, that something sacred is present. I said, Mr. Reyes, I'm going to ask you one more question, and I want you to answer it honestly. No need to protect anybody or manage anybody's feelings, just the truth. He said, yes, Your Honor. I said, when you wear that smile, the one you've got on right now, the one that says everything is okay, how often do you actually believe it? The silence that followed that question was one of the longest silences I've ever experienced in my courtroom. And I've had silences that felt like they lasted years. He looked at me. For the first time since he'd walked in, he looked at me fully, without the management, without the careful armor fully in place. Just for a moment, just a crack. And then he said, quietly, not as often as I'd like, Your Honor, but more than I used to. That's progress, right? That's progress, right? I had to pause. I took my glasses off. I placed them on the desk in front of me. I pressed my fingers to my eyes for just a second. I don't do that often on the bench. But I needed that moment. I needed to honor what he had just shared with me, the real answer underneath all the armor, without pretending I wasn't moved by it. I looked back at him and I said, Mr. Reyes, yes, that is absolutely progress, and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. Now let me tell you what I did next and why I did it. I've waived fines before. I've reduced charges. I've dismissed cases. I've done it when the law gave me the room to do so and when my conscience told me it was the right thing. But what I did for Daniel Reyes, I did for every reason I have ever believed in about what justice is actually for. I said, Mr. Reyes, you came into this courtroom today prepared to pay every dollar of these fines. You were honest about your violations. You showed no attitude, no excuses, no attempt to avoid responsibility. That alone tells me everything I need to know about your character. He said, I just tried to be honest, Your Honor. I said, I know, and that's a rarer thing than you might think. I picked up the file. I looked at the total one more time. $452. To some people, that's an afterthought. To a veteran living in transitional housing, looking for work, managing his mental health, navigating a life that got turned upside down by service to this country, that $452 is a very real and very heavy thing. I said, Mr. Reyes, you served this country. You put yourself in harm's way not because you had to, but because you believed in something larger than yourself. You came back changed because war changes people. That's not a weakness. That's the cost of what you did for all of us sitting in this room. For me, for my clerk, for every person in this gallery. I saw him swallow. His jaw moved slightly. The smile was still there, but it had softened. It wasn't armor anymore. It was just a face. A real face. His face. I said, I'm waiving all of these fines today. Every single one. Case dismissed in full. The courtroom broke into applause. I don't stop people when they do that. Sometimes the room needs to respond. Sometimes it would be wrong to contain it. I let it go for a moment. I watched Daniel Reyes. He stood at the podium and he looked down for a second. And when he looked back up, his eyes were wet. Not crying, not yet, but wet. That particular brightness that eyes get right before the wall comes all the way down. He said, Your Honor, you don't have to do that. I came prepared to pay. I said, I know you did, and that matters. But so does what you've been through. Both things can be true at the same time. Before I tell you what happened in the next moment, I want to ask you something. Do you think wealth or status should determine how someone is treated in a court of law? Do you think a veteran who came home carrying invisible wounds deserves the same compassion as anyone else who stands before a judge? Tell me in the comments. Tell me what you think justice looks like in moments like this one. And if you believe in equal justice for every human being, subscribe to this channel right now. Because I've got more stories like this one, and every single one of them matters. I stood up from my bench. I want you to understand what that means. I don't stand up during a session unless something requires it. The bench is where I work. Staying behind it is part of the formality, the structure, the respect that the courtroom deserves. But in that moment, I felt that staying seated would have been wrong. It would have been too distant, too formal, not enough for what this man deserved. I came around the bench, and I walked to where he was standing at the podium. The whole room was very still. Christina looked at me with wide eyes. I've known her long enough to know that look. It says, this is something different. This is something important. I extended my hand to Daniel Reyes. He looked at it for just a moment, and then he reached out and shook it. His grip was firm, strong, the grip of a man who had trained that body to do very hard things. I held his hand for a second longer than a normal handshake. I wanted him to feel that I meant it, that this wasn't a gesture, that this was one human being saying to another, I see you, I hear you. What you did mattered. What you're going through matters. I said to him, quietly enough that only he could hear, though I know the room was straining to listen, I said, you're going to be okay. Not because everything is easy, but because you're still fighting. And men who keep fighting, they find their way. He said, thank you, Your Honor. His voice broke slightly on the last word. Just slightly, just enough. I said, no, thank you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for your honesty this morning. Thank you for still showing up. He nodded. He pressed his lips together. He was doing that thing people do when they're trying not to cry in a public place, working their jaw, looking at the ceiling for a moment. I gave him the space to do that. I walked back to my bench and I sat down and I looked at my next file, giving him a moment to gather himself without an audience. When he walked out, the woman in the back row, the one who had been crying quietly, she stood up as he passed her. She reached out and touched his arm. He looked at her, surprised. She said something to him that I couldn't hear. He nodded. She nodded. And then he was gone out the door, and she sat back down and wiped her eyes. I had to take a breath before I called the next case. The rest of that Thursday moved forward. More cases, more people, more stories. But I carried Daniel with me through every one of them. I thought about what he said when I asked him how often he believed his own smile. I thought about that pause before the answer. I thought about a young man who had gone to places I've only seen on the news, who had done things that kept the rest of us safe and asleep in our beds at night, who had come home carrying invisible weight, who had lost his marriage to that weight, who was living in transitional housing and going to the VA twice a week and wearing a smile that he'd learned to wear because the world didn't know what to do with the truth underneath it. And I thought about what my father said to me all those years ago. They are carrying something you cannot see. Be kind. Always be kind. My father was a wise man. He never went to college. He worked with his hands his whole life. He didn't have a law degree or a bench or a gavel, but he understood people in a way that I've spent 4 decades trying to match. He understood that behind every face there's a story, and behind every story there's a human being who deserves to be met with dignity. I think about the men and women who serve this country. I think about what we ask of them. We send them to the hardest places on earth. We put them in situations that no human mind was designed to navigate without cost. And then we bring them home, and we expect them to just step back into their lives like they stepped out of them, like nothing happened, like the gap between who they were before and who they are now can be closed with a firm handshake and a thank you for your service. But it can't. It just can't. And for some of them, for men like Daniel Reyes, that gap swallows things that can never be gotten back. Relationships, marriages, the simple ability to sit in a quiet room without bracing for something. The ability to look at the person who loves you and let them all the way in instead of keeping them at arm's length to protect them from what you're carrying. His wife left. She said he wasn't the same person she married. And he told me, standing at my podium, I understand. I don't hold it against her. And that somehow broke my heart more than the leaving itself. Because what kind of man has so much compassion for the person who left him that he can stand in a courtroom and say, I understand? What kind of man carries that kind of grace alongside everything else he's carrying? That kind of man deserves every good thing this world can offer him. And the very least I could do, the smallest and most inadequate thing I could possibly offer in return, was to waive $452 in parking fines and stand up and shake his hand. It's not enough. I know it's not enough. But it was what I had in that moment, and I gave it completely. Later that afternoon, after court was done, I sat in my chambers for a while longer than usual. Christina came in and asked if everything was okay. I told her about what had gone through my head during Daniel's case. She listened carefully, the way she always does, and when I was done, she said, You know, I noticed something this morning. When he walked out, he was still wearing the smile, but it was a little lighter. I think it was a little lighter than when he walked in. I've thought about that observation many times since. A little lighter. Maybe that's all any of us can do for someone who's carrying what Daniel carries. We can't lift the whole weight. We can't undo what happened or put back together what was lost. But maybe we can make it just a little lighter, for just a moment, by seeing the person fully, by saying out loud what we recognize in them, by refusing to let them stand in front of us invisible. About 2 weeks after that Thursday, Christina came into my chambers in the morning, and she had a small envelope in her hand. She said, "This came for you." There was no return address, but the postmark was Providence. I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded in thirds. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who had been taught to write properly and still took care with it. It said, "Your Honor, I've been thinking about what to write since the morning I was in your courtroom. I'm not great with words. My therapist says I should practice expressing things, so here I go. What you did that day meant more than the money. I was ready to pay. I had put that money aside. But when you stood up and walked over and shook my hand, I lost it on the inside. I held it together because that's what I do, but on the inside I was completely undone. Nobody outside my unit and my therapy group has ever looked at me like I was worth something since I came home. I don't mean that to sound as sad as it does. I just mean the world moves fast and people are busy, and I came back into it quieter than I left. And most people don't notice quiet. You noticed. You asked the right questions. You listened to the real answers. I want you to know that I'm okay. I'm going to keep being okay. I got a job offer this week. Construction management, the kind I was looking for. I start in 2 weeks. It's not everything, but it's a beginning. I still have the smile. But maybe I mean it a little more now. Respectfully, Daniel Reyes. I read that letter 3 times sitting at my desk. Then I folded it back into thirds and put it carefully in the drawer where I keep the things that matter. Over the years, that drawer has accumulated letters, notes, photographs, small tokens that people have left with me as expressions of something they couldn't fully say in the courtroom. Every one of them represents a moment when the law and the human being met somewhere real and honest. Daniel's letter is in there now. It will stay there as long as I have that desk. You know what keeps me putting on these robes every morning after 40 years? It's moments exactly like this one. It's the reminder that what I do here is not just about fines and dates and charges on paper. It's about people. Real people with real lives and real weight on their shoulders. When justice works the way it's supposed to, it's not cold. It's not mechanical. It's warm and human, and it sees the person standing in front of it. If this story is restoring your faith in what justice can look like, show me by hitting that subscribe button and that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, because these stories deserve to reach as many people as possible. I think about what Daniel said. I came back a little different than when I left. I've turned that sentence over in my mind so many times, because in a way, isn't that all of us? Don't we all come back from the difficult things in our lives a little different than when we went in? Grief changes you. Loss changes you. Hardship changes you. And the question isn't whether you came back different. The question is what you do with the difference. Do you let it isolate you? Do you armor yourself completely and never let anyone see the real cost of what you've been through? Or do you do what Daniel Reyes was doing? Slowly, painfully, imperfectly, do you keep showing up? Do you keep going to the appointments? Do you keep sitting in the rooms where people understand? Do you keep trying to find a way forward, even when forward looks nothing like what you planned? He said, "That's progress, right?" And I said, "Yes." And I meant it with everything I had. I've thought about his wife, too. I have compassion for her. I do. I don't think she was wrong to feel what she felt, or even to make the choice she made. Love is hard. Loving someone who is suffering in ways they can't fully show you, that's one of the most demanding things a human being can do. Sometimes people can, and sometimes they can't. I don't sit in judgment of that. What I do carry is the image of that young man standing at my podium alone, having driven himself to court alone, prepared to pay every fine alone, wearing that smile alone. And I carry it as a reminder of how much we owe to the people who come home different. My grandson turned 12 last month. He's a bright, curious boy who asks big questions about everything. He asked me once what I do when I go to work. I told him I listen to people's stories and I try to be fair. He thought about that for a moment and then he said, "But what if you feel bad for somebody? What do you do then?" And I said, "You still have to be fair. But feeling bad for somebody, that's not a problem. That's just what it means to be a human being doing a human job." He seemed satisfied with that answer. I think about it a lot. The law is not supposed to be separate from humanity. The law is supposed to serve humanity. And when I see a young veteran standing at my podium, carrying invisible wounds, alone in the world, wearing a smile that costs him something to keep in place, the law tells me to look at the charges. But my humanity, the humanity my father gave me, the humanity I've cultivated in 40 years of this work, that tells me to look at the person, to ask the real questions, to listen for the real answers, and then to do whatever small thing I can to honor what's true. So let me ask you this. Do you think I made the right decision? Do you think waiving those fines and shaking his hand was the right thing to do? I'm genuinely curious what you think. Leave me a comment. Tell me. Because I believe in having these conversations. I believe that thinking about justice, talking about it, arguing about it in good faith, that's how we keep it real and meaningful. And here's another question for you. If you were in my position that morning, what would you have done? Would you have kept it strictly professional? Would you have gone further? I would love to know where you stand on that, because there are no simple answers in this work. And I think the most important thing any of us can do is keep asking the hard questions. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. I actually read them, every single one. Not all in the same sitting, but I get to them. And when I read one that's thoughtful and honest, it means something to me. It reminds me that the things I experience in that courtroom reach beyond those walls and touch people I'll never meet. And that matters more than I can say. If this story meant something to you, if you believe that every human being deserves to be seen and heard, regardless of what they've been through or what they've lost, do me a favor, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Turn on that bell icon so you never miss another story from my courtroom. Because every week I'm bringing you real moments, real people, real lessons about what it means to live with integrity and treat every person who stands before you with the dignity they deserve. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. Maybe you know a veteran. Maybe you know someone who came back from something hard, a war, a loss, a period of life that changed them, and they're wearing a smile that doesn't quite reach their eyes. Share this with them. Let them know they're seen. That's the whole point. That's why these stories matter. And check out the next video on your screen. I've got another story from my courtroom that I think you're going to feel in your chest. I'll be back tomorrow with another lesson about justice, about respect, about the things that make us human in a world that sometimes forgets to slow down long enough to notice the people standing right in front of us. I'm Frank Caprio. I've been on this bench for 40 years because I believe something simple. We're all equal before the law, every single one of us, rich or poor, decorated or unknown, whole or broken, carrying something visible or carrying something only you can feel. In my courtroom, you stand on the same ground as everyone else. And on the best days, on the days that remind me why I still get up at the same time and drive the same route and pour the same cup of coffee, on those days, the law doesn't just process you, it sees you. And being seen, really seen, by someone who has the power to look away and chooses not to, that can make a difference that no dollar amount can ever measure. Thank you for listening to my story. God bless you, and remember, respect costs nothing, but it's worth everything.